Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher. Welcome to Sweetwater's Guitars and Gear. This time out, a special preview of new products from TC at Winter NAMM 2016. Today we're joined by Tor Mogensen from TC Electronic, based out of Denmark, and you're passing through on your way to the NAMM show in Anaheim, California.
Yes, it seemed like a perfect little detour to come here. You know, this is an awesome place to go, so I was happy to come by.
We're glad to have you back. You've been here before.
I've been here a few times. We've done videos. I've done a morning session at some point as well.
Right.
So, yeah.
So the big change is you have long hair and I have short hair.
Yeah,
I think it was the other way around.
Mine's got progressively longer.
Right, mine keeps getting shorter. So it's just the way things are.
Yeah.
Right. So you got some great new products that are coming out at Winter NAMM. 3 new pedals we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
Tell us what we're looking at.
Well, first of all, we're looking at the Ditto X4 here, and a couple of years ago we launched Ditto Looper, which was this tiny little, very simple looping pedal that tried to rethink the idea of what a looper was. Just make something that's very easy to use for guitar players, for practicing and stuff like that. And
right.
Over the years, we've added, more features. We've added some bigger ones, but we kept getting requests from our customers adding, please, can you add some more features? Mm-hmm. And the main new feature that, that people asked for was actually to have more than one looper in a product. So this is Ditto X4 here, and that's exactly what you get. So basically, it's like the core of the pedal is having 2 loopers in one. And because you are not actually physically having 2 loopers next to each other, but they're actually in the same pedal, you can do a lot of cool stuff where you can actually sync the 2 loops up and have some automation going that allows you to create some pretty cool song ideas and stuff like that.
Wow. So they can operate both independently and simultaneously.
Yeah, we have 2 different modes. So basically, if you think of it, they work, if anybody's familiar with Ditto Looper, the individual loopers work exactly the same way. So you can record, you can overdub, you can stop and do all the stuff you can do on a regular Ditto looper. But up here with this little switch is really where the magic kind of happens, because you can set it in 2 different modes. And right now it's set to what we call serial mode. And that means that you can have something going in loop 1, let's say that it's a verse, and then you can have something other going in loop 2. And when I switch between them, it automatically turns off the other loop. So you can have 2 different things and you can basically switch between them.
Nice.
And I can show you real quick. I've recorded something in loop 1 and I've recorded something in loop 2, and then I can switch between them.
Okay.
And just a quick mention on the back here, there's a little dip switch that decides whether the loop switches right away or when the loop ends, and it's set to when the loop ends. So it makes it a little easier to time the loops perfectly. So I'll just start this up. So you can see it automatically switches between the 2, which makes it a lot easier to actually sync up, the timing of the loops.
Right, right.
So that's one way of using it. The other way of using it is what we call sync mode. And in this way, the 2 loopers work together, but they can play at the same time. And the timing is basically stretched. So let's say you make something like a little percussive thing on your guitar that's just 1 bar in loop 1. Then you can add something, chords or whatever, on top of that in loop 2. But you can actually have a multiple bars of that. So you can have 1 bar in loop 1 and then 4 bars or 8 bars or whatever you want in loop 2. So, just a lot of creative possibilities for guys who are into looping.
Yeah, absolutely. So you could have a verse and a chorus, or you could have 2 sections of a solo or whatever you're
You can either do that or you can do the other thing where you're basically building this big track, classic Ed Sheeran style or Katie Tunstall or some of these, adventurous loopers out there.
Right, right. So what are some of these other controls here do? I see we have a decay control and it looks like an effects control.
Yeah, if we start with the effects control, we started adding a few effects in Ditto X2, and we just got requests to add a bunch more. Mm-hmm. So I can show you real quick. The ones that are in Ditto X2 is reverse and half speed, and it pretty self-explanatory. It plays the loop back in reverse or in half speed, and then on top of that we added for the more traditionalist, we added a play once, which is basically just hit the switch, it plays the loop to the end and then it stops, which is nice if you want to end the performance right on the time. Mm-hmm. Again, you don't have to worry about the timing. The pedal does that for you.
Right.
Then we have a tape stop, which I can show you real quick here. So it basically sounds like somebody just slowed down the tape.
Nice.
And then you can bring it back in again. And fade basically fades out the loop over time, and this depends on the length of the loop. So the longer the loop, the longer the fade time. If it's a short loop, it's going to fade it out faster. Double is double speed, and the last one is a stuttering effect. So you can do a lot of different creative things with this pedal for the more,
Right.
the guys who are really into looping. The last knob on here is a decay effect, and let me see if I can explain that. So typically when you have a looper and you add overdubs, it's almost like a layered cake. You keep adding more layers, and at some point, sometimes it almost gets too much. There's too many layers, it gets too cluttered. And the idea from this really came from delay pedals, where you have a feedback control where you can actually decide how many repeats you get. And if you compare a looper to a delay pedal, a looper, it just keeps stacking. That would be the equivalent of a delay pedal, just, where the feedback is just cranked all the way up and you just keep adding repeats and repeats and repeats.
Right.
With this one, we can actually, if you crank it all the way up, it just keeps stacking layers. But when you back it down, as you add new layers, it actually takes the original, the first ones away. So over time, you can actually morph your loop from one thing to another.
Right.
Which again is, for the guys who are into looping, it's, brings out some really cool creative possibilities.
Right. What I like about all that is that one of the inherent limitations of looping is that you record the loop and you've got the loop.
Yeah.
You can add things on top of it, but
the original thing is
it's
there.
there,
for,
right.
Yeah.
But you've added so much interactivity here to where you can really process the loop and do different things with it and really kind of make it evolve over the course of a song. That's
exactly.
very cool.
But at the same time, trying to keep it simple. I mean, there's a dedicated knob for anything. There's no press and hold functions. There's no, display. It's still very much a guitar pedal in that traditional sense.
Right. Very simple to operate.
And then a few extra things on the back here, stereo in, out. Pretty important thing for the serious loopers is MIDI control, which is the first product we've added that to. And you can pretty much control the entire pedal via MIDI CCs and program changes, but I think the main thing is really that the pedal syncs up to MIDI clock. So if you want to do a loop performance, anybody who tried to do that without some kind of MIDI clock will know that even if you're right on time, if you're just 1 millisecond ahead or behind, each time the loop goes over, you add that 1 millisecond. So over the course of a song, you've drifted. But with MIDI clock, you basically just time it right in, so you can use it with a drum machine or your favorite DAW or whatever.
Yeah, sure, right. And I see that you have another switch here. It says store and backing track level. And
this is something we added in Ditto X2, and we brought that into Ditto X4 as well, of course. And the idea behind that is really that sometimes if you want to make a loop performance, it's kind of nice to be able to prepare something, back home. So if you want to create a backing track on your computer, with drums and everything, you can load that into the pedal.
Okay.
And then you can play with that. And the other way around as well, if you create something on the pedal that you really like, you can store it as a backing track and then take it out of the computer again. And the last thing that I think is pretty cool about that is, so let's say that you're a performing looper. So every night you go out, you gig, and you have this, basic track that you want to add on top of. But the basic track should stay the same. On regular loopers, what happens is that as you build layers, when you want to start over again, you have to delete the entire thing and start over.
Right.
On the Dittos, on Ditto X2 and Ditto X4 here, if you turn something into a backing track, you basically keep that as the core track. So anything you add on top of that will obviously be added. But when you delete them again, you only delete the added stuff. The core loop stays there. So you can basically go back to your original loop night after night and don't have to create it again from scratch.
Nice.
So it's a cool little extra thing. And with Ditto X2, because it has 2 loopers, you can basically add 2 different things. So you can have a verse and a chorus that you create back home with bass and drums and everything, and just load it into pedal and switch between them.
All right, very cool, very cool. So did most of these ideas for these enhancements and the different directions you've gone here, did they come from user requests, or are these things you think of, or where do these ideas come from?
It's a mixture. I think, we get a lot of these requests, but, we sit and think about them as well. So, typically what happens is that we have this long list of things that, this would be cool to add. And then when we get some user requests, we kind of say, okay, so this seems like something that kind of resonate with what the customers want. So a lot of these things, basically come both from the internal TC side and from customers.
Right.
And some of them are basically just, flat out requests. So this decay thing actually came specifically from Steve Morse. And I was showing the original Ditto looper, which he liked, but he mentioned that he had an old product that wasn't made anymore that actually had that feature. And it was more of a delay pedal, but it could be used as a looper, and he really liked that feature. asked if we can add that to the product. So we did that, and I wouldn't have thought of that. I didn't know that existed. So so that's a very specific request from something.
So you didn't name that the Steve Morse feature?
We should have done that. Sorry, Steve.
So obviously you have a terrible job. You sit around thinking about pedals all day.
Yes, it's horrible.
I don't know how you stand it.
No, it's a tough job. Somebody has to do it. And I get to travel from snowy Denmark to
snowy Fort Wayne.
Yeah.
But now we're headed to California, so that's okay.
Yeah, and again, I mean, my main job is really coming up with the product ideas and stuff. So sorry for any kind of crummy noodling you'll hear later on. I'm not really a demo guy at all. I'm more of a product guy, but.
No, you're a great guitar player. So. In fact, would you like to play a little bit for us? Show us how the loop works?
Yeah. So again, if I just start the same loop again, then I can solo a bit over that and then switch between the two loops. And nice. There you go.
Nice, very nice.
It's a little tricky to actually do any looping when it's up here.
When you have to use your hand to switch.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess most people by now know how a looper works in terms of, adding overdubs and stuff. So I think some of the new stuff that's in here is really the ability to create more of a song as opposed to, just one loop that you play over. This gives you some more opportunities and things, both for performance, of course, but also for just practicing. If, say, you want to practice going from one chord progression to another in a fluid way, it's pretty nice to be able to do that on this pedal.
All right, very cool. So the Ditto X4 looper is not the only new pedal that's coming from TC this year. You've also got the Bonafide buffer. And tell us about this pedal.
Yeah, I mean, a buffer is this thing that I think a lot of people don't really understand what it does. It's kind of a weird thing because it's not an effect as such. It's basically just a way to, keep your core signal intact and sounding nice.
Right.
And I think a lot of guitar players are used to talking about true bypass pedals as, the way to go. Mm-hmm. But at least to me and the philosophy we have at TC is that, true bypass is great, but when you have that, it's great to have at least one buffer in the signal somehow. And let me see if I can try to explain that. So basically, the more cables you add, the longer cables and the more pedals you add. Basically, if you have all true bypass pedals, because of the high impedance signal of a guitar, what really happens is the same thing that happens when you roll off the tone knob on your guitar. You get a duller, more dark sound, and also you lose a little bit of volume. Mm-hmm. And if you have all true bypass pedals, that'll happen because a guitar signal is by nature it's not a very powerful one.
Right.
So what a buffer does is basically compensate for that by turning the high impedance signal into a low impedance signal, and that's much more robust. So basically, you can run as long cable length as you want to without any kind of signal degradation.
Right.
So a buffer, the best buffer is really something you don't hear unless you turn it off, and then you can hear how it would sound if it didn't, you didn't have it in there. So the goal is, I think, for guitar players in general, is always the sound you really want is if you take a really short cable and you take your guitar and you plug it straight into your amp. Mm-hmm. That's the sound. And I think a lot of guitar players, we tried to, we heard that sound and we think it sounds great. It's, just the true sound of the guitar and the amp. And then you run through your pedal board and you go like, oh, what happened? It doesn't sound as good anymore.
Right.
And that's what a buffer is for. It's basically for bringing back all that high end and all that sparkly sound that you get when you plug directly into the amp.
Right.
So a buffer should sound like plugging directly into the amp.
Mm-hmm. That's the core thing. Yeah. Right.
And obviously it shouldn't color the sound in itself. And that's why I think some people don't like buffers or are afraid of buffers because they fear that, the buffer isn't transparent. Mm-hmm. So then they start adding color in itself. So, that's kind of the mix up between having a buffer and not.
Right.
So I think, you know, in an ideal guitar setup, you'd have one buffer at the beginning of your signal chain, and then 2 bypass pedals for the rest of it.
Now, will this work if you do have other buffered pedals in the chain? Is there a problem with doing that?
No, there's no problem at all. But obviously, I mean, the idea of a buffer is really that you go through a circuit of some kind to kind of, you know, help bring the signal back and make it more robust. And with any kind of buffer, you know, there is the risk that you go through that circuit and that circuit somehow colors the sound, which is why 2 bypass pedals are nice in the sense that, you know, you run directly through them, so there's nothing to color the signal. But we worked really hard on Bonafide buffer to make sure that it's absolutely transparent, and it's a little tricky to display in general.
Right.
It's even more tricky to, you know, do it here on YouTube with the sound quality and all.
Right.
But it is really, really transparent.
Right. And we do have, the way we're set up here is we have, this is a custom shop Stratocaster, and it's going through 2 Astrope cables, which are high-end, very transparent cables, and into a deluxe reverb here behind us. And here in the room, the clarity and the transparency of the Bonafide is obvious.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not getting coloration out of the buffer at all.
And the funny thing is, because we can test it, even though it's going to be hard to hear the difference. Now, if you have a 2 bypass pedal and you cut the power to the pedal, you will still be able to play through it. If you have a buffered pedal and you lose the power, you will get no sound, because, you know, the circuit requires power to actually work. So if you have any kind of pedal that by nature is buffered, if you lose power, then you also lose your signal.
Right.
So typically, if you have a buffer pedal and you cut the power, you wouldn't be able to hear anything, so you wouldn't be able to A/B it. But what we've done here in Bonafide buffer is that, you know, the pedal is all analog, but there's a tiny little digital circuit in there that controls a relay. And the relay basically does one thing, and that is when we cut the power, we switch to 2 bypass mode. So when the pedal has power, it's always buffered. You can't turn it off, it's just there. But when you remove the power, it actually switches to 2 bypass mode, which means that even if you lose power on your pedal board, you'll still be able to play through the amp, which is a nice little extra feature.
And we can show that, right?
Yeah,
go ahead and play.
And the other thing is that actually means that we can hear that we can actually A/B a little bit.
Right.
So here's the sound of the guitar going into the amp through the buffer. And then I can do this. And it's, I mean, I don't know if it comes across on the video, but it is actually, I think it's actually clear that there's a little bit of treble loss. It's very slight. Get a little bit of that sparkle back from the Strat. And obviously, if we'd had longer cables and if we'd had like a, you know, 8 pedal board here with cables going between them, it would be even more obvious. And the longer cables you have, the more pedals you have, the more obvious that's going to be. And I think, you know, for anybody out there kind of wondering, do I need a buffer or not? The really easy way to do that is take your shortest cable, plug your guitar into your amp and hear how that sounds, then go through your pedal board, through all your local usual cables, and hear if there's a difference. And if there is a difference, then that's a good reason to get a buffer.
Sure. I think what's really impressive here is that there was no hiccup, there was no pop, there was no click, there was nothing when it just transparently switched from one to the other. That's very cool.
Yeah. And this is, I mean, most of the tone print pedals, or actually all the tone print pedals, have a built-in buffer. And the Bonafide buffer is based on that circuit, but it's a vastly improved one. So it's an evolvement of that circuit.
Right. But that, just to be totally clear, no pun intended, the buffer on those is only active when the pedal is active. Otherwise they're true bypass?
They're true bypass, but there's a little dip switch inside them that actually allows you to select whether they're buffered or true bypass. So you can, they're both really.
So you can put it either way, right?
Yeah. But again, I mean, at least for me, as somebody who's way too nerdy about pedals, I mean, I would design my pedal board as having a buffer at the beginning, all true bypass pedals, then maybe a buffer at the end. And that would be, you know, like the ideal one, or at least having a buffer at the beginning, as close to the guitar as possible. You want to cut down the cable length to the shortest amount. So guitar into a buffer would mean that, you know, you only have that one cable from the guitar to the buffer that actually kind of degrades the sound. And then from there, it's the same all the way through.
Right. Great advice.
So yeah, that's Bonafide buffer. It's a nice little utility thing, I think.
Yeah, very cool. So the third of the 3 pedals that you're introducing at Winter NAMM is actually a bass pedal.
Hence the bass.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It magically appeared in your hands there.
And I have bass players around the world going like, that's so wrong on a guitar player. But, bear with me. It's for demonstration
Because we're here to
purposes
talk
only.
about a pedal, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And what pedal do we have?
Well, we have the SpectraComp bass compressor. And around half a year ago, we announced or launched Hypergravity, which is a guitar compressor. And SpectraComp is really using the same core algorithm, which is taken from something called the MD3, which is an algorithm we invented for System 6000, which is the super expensive mastering tool that's used both in music production but also in film production to basically keep everything at proper levels and, make sure that everything sounds great without being, noticeably compressed.
Right.
So we basically made a version of that algorithm, but tweaked it so that it sounds great for guitar, and now also for bass.
Oh, wonderful. And it couldn't get any simpler to operate.
It's very, very simple. But the interesting thing is that even though it looks super simple, behind the scenes or inside the pedal, there are literally hundreds of parameters going on. Because what really makes SpectraComp stand apart is the fact that it's a multiband compressor. So there's really 3 individual compressors running at the same time. And the benefit of that is, let me see if I can explain that. If you have a regular compressor, you're basically compressing the signal, the entire signal, to the same amount. And the problem with that is that there's radically different levels of energy on the low and the high strings of a bass or a guitar for that matter. So plugging in the low strings compared to the high strings, you can even hear it. There's less level on the high strings.
Right.
And the problem is that a compressor is actually getting triggered by the level. So if you set the threshold, which is basically the place where the compressor triggers, if you set it to match the low strings, you don't get enough compression on the high strings. Vice versa, if you set it to match the the high strings, then you get too much compression on the low strings.
Right.
And it's always this dilemma of getting the proper balance. And with a regular compressor, it's really, really hard to find that balance. You'll typically try to match it to the low strings so that you don't have too boomy a low end. And that means that the high strings really don't come into their right properly.
Right.
But with a multiband compressor, you can basically compress, if not per string, then close to that. On SpectraComp, we have 3 different compressors running, which is basically one for the low end, one for the mid-range, and one for the high strings.
Okay.
So enough with the talking. Hopefully I can play a little bit and you can hear the difference.
Sure.
So an easy way to hear this is playing harmonics while at the same time having the low strings ringing. So I'll do something like this. And then I can turn on the compressor and you can hear the difference. You can hear how suddenly the dynamics just disappear altogether.
Right, right.
So that's what a compressor is really great for bass. It's just kind of taking the entire sound and kind of, making it whole and having that kind of sparkly high end be there in there as well, not being overpowered by the low end.
Right, right. You really hear how the balance between the low string and the 2 harmonics really evens out. It really becomes much more stable across the whole thing. And that's the same if you're popping and
exactly. And I wouldn't presume to start playing funk bass at all, but if I were to do that, it's the same thing. When you do the hammer-ons with the thumb, they have a tendency without a compressor to be much louder than the popping. So when you add the compressor, you get a more even sound across the frequency spectrum.
Right.
And again, I mean, as you mentioned before, the pedal is very, very simple. Actually, it's more simple than pretty much any other compressor pedal out there because there's really only one knob. And typically on compressors, you'll find 2 knobs. You'll find one to control the amount of compression and one to control the level, because on compressors, when you add more compression, you also have to add more level to kind of match up for that.
Right.
But because we can do all sorts of trickery inside the pedal, we can actually basically marry those 2 at the same time and make sure that the level is the correct, which is basically the same as if you weren't plugged into the pedal at all, no matter how much you gain. So I can kind of show you that here. So now it's at the minimum position. So we're adding compression, but the level stays the same. And now, so it just makes it super, super easy and simple to use.
Right, right.
Another thing, I mean, even though it's so simple, as I mentioned before, there's literally hundreds of parameters inside. And if you want to start, nerding out and trying to be a little bit more in control of what's going on, there's plenty of opportunities because SpectraComp is part of our tone print range of pedals. So that means that we're starting to work with all these really cool bass players to create tone prints for them, or for the pedal.
Right.
Meaning that you can get, cool artists dialing in the compressor exactly the way they like it, and you can get that sound as well. We already started adding a few. Ida, the bass player from Prince's band, has done some, and we have a whole bunch of artists lined up at NAMM here in a couple of days or in a week or so that'll do that as well.
That's great.
And on top of that, if you want to go really crazy, you can also download the editor, which you can hook up. You can hook up the pedal to either a Mac or a PC or an iPad, and that gives you access to all the parameters that we use in the engineering department to actually design the sound. So basically, you become a pedal designer, and you can basically dial in the compressor to sound exactly the way you want it. But there's a lot of parameters in there. So,
but you can also use that to save different settings, and then you can use your phone
to basically beam them directly in there, and it's super easy to just hold it over the pickups and just beam the sounds right in there.
So you can kind of create a library of your own.
You can do
compressor settings if you want
to. And to make things a little bit more easy for guys who are not that familiar with compressors, inside the editor there's also a bunch of templates, as we call them, that are basically here's something great for slapping bass, here's something great for guys who play with a pick, and so on. So you can use that as a starting point and then kind of tweak it from there.
Right. All right, very cool.
So it's, very simple pedal if you want it to be, but also incredibly complex and, totally customizable if you want it to be that. And something in between with the artist stuff, you can basically, pick your favorite bass player and just load his sound or her sound directly into the pedal.
Right.
So it brings a lot of different opportunities.
Right, very cool. Very cool. Tor, all three of these pedals are awesome.
Cool, thanks.
Really looking forward to getting my hands on them. I know it's going to be very exciting heading to the NAMM show and introducing all these.
It's very exciting indeed.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, thanks for taking your time to stop here on your way out to sunny California. You're escaping the snow and stopping here in the snow. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to have you here. Come back soon.
I will do that.
Bring more cool pedals.
Thank you. I'll do that.
Great to see you, my friend.
You too.
And thanks for joining us for Sweetwater's Guitars and Gear. Be sure to tune in next time. We'll have more guitars, more amps, more effects. We'll be making lots of music. I'm Mitch Gallagher.